Hi. So here I'm simply scrolling this question: is behavior always a reflection of one's attitude? Explain with a relevant example. Right? So is behavior always a reflection of one's attitude? You have to first understand that always, right? The reflection of one's attitude. I'm scrolling this question, just go through this, pause it and understand. I will explain the initial part here. So if you can see in few lines, they have tried to describe, answer it, and then there are the further explanation here. An individual's attitude may not always be exhibited through behavior, right? Always, right? This is one hint that has been asked. Sometimes it can be a reflection of one's attitude, but not always. One's actual behavior may be contrary to one's attitude towards a particular topic, right? So you may feel different, you may have a different attitude, a positive attitude towards a certain attitude object, right? So the attitude object, it can be, maybe the attitude object is cleanliness, right? And you're having a positive attitude towards that, but sometimes your behavior may not be in line with this, right? So attitude may not always predict actual pattern of one's behavior. Sometimes it is behavior that decides the attitude, right? So sometimes you can be against, contrary to the attitude that you have. Sometimes your behavior is something else and your attitude has something else. Sometimes your behavior decides the attitude, sometimes your attitude decides the behavior, right? Sometimes it is behavior that decides the attitude. Now few points that has been mentioned here that I really wanted to discuss is that the psychologists, this is the empirical details that has been mentioned here, that the psychologists have found that there would be consistency between the attitude and behavior. When will there be a consistency? So these all are the empirical, empirical means evidence based, because this has been mentioned by the psychologists, right? So the attitude is, when there is a consistency between an attitude and an behavior. First is when attitude is strong and occupies a central place. Centrality that we had discussed, valence, extremeness, and centrality. So when the attitude has a central place, it has a very strong occupancy, right? Then it will impact our behavior. Second is the person is aware of his or her, so the awareness is there that this is our attitude and this is how we have to behave, right? Third is that there is very little or no external pressure for the person to behave in a particular way. So like if I was talking about cleanliness, now let's take an attitude object. It can be mental health, right? If the attitude object is mental health and you have a positive attitude towards that mental health, and you are aware of that you have this attitude, your behavior will always be positive towards this attitude. And if there is no external pressure for the person to behave in a particular way, that the person is pressurized to talk against the mental health implementations or any other stuffs, then only the person will behave in a different way. If the external pressure is not there, they will consistently be behaving in as per their attitude. Now what is the third point here? The psychologists have mentioned that the person's behavior is not being watched or evaluated by others, right? So sometimes it can happen that you have a negative attitude, but you are behaving as a positive, or you have a positive attitude but you are behaving as a negative collaboration. So sometimes you are behaving as per your attitude when your behavior is not been watched or evaluated by them, by the others, right? So if you are not being evaluated, not being observed by others, then you might be behaving in that particular zone only. Now the last point here is the person thinks that the behavior would make a positive consequence and therefore intends to engage in this behavior, right? So here you see the strong attitude is strong and occupies a central place, is aware of, and this point, and these points collaborates, right? The person thinks that the behavior would make a positive consequence and therefore intends to engage in this behavior. So here there are few pointers also been mentioned. That first they had been saying that it's not always that your individual's attitude impacts your behavior, but also few points has been mentioned where your attitude is and your behavior are the same. Okay, when this point is also important, so I'll describe this one also. In a time when Americans were said to be prejudiced against the Chinese, Richard LaPierre, an American social psychologist, conducted the following study. Now, if you talk about the study, this is always evidence-based, empirical examples that you can always give, because this is not fictional. So, what Richard said was, he asked a Chinese couple to travel across the United States and stay in different hotels. Only once during these occasions, they were refused service by one of the hotels. So now, in a time when Americans were said to be prejudiced against the Chinese, right? So Americans were prejudiced against the Chinese, and then a research was conducted where a Chinese was asked to stay in the different hotels in United States. Only once during these occasions they were refused service by one of the hotels. Sometimes later, he sent out questionnaires to managers of hotels and tourist home in some areas where the Chinese couple had traveled, asking them if they would give accommodation to Chinese guests. A very large percentage said that they would not do so. Right? So here, this is point 1 and this is point 2. So what are we talking about is the attitude and the behavior, right? So Americans were prejudiced against Chinese. Sorry. So the Americans were prejudiced against Chinese. Correct. But what the psychologist was trying to prove here is that he actually asked the Chinese to travel to United States, and then the Chinese was they were refused service by they only once it happened that they were refused service. But in the survey they said that they will not give accommodation to the Chinese guests. Now what is the result of this response? This response showed a negative attitude towards the Chinese, which was inconsistent with the positive behavior that was actually shown towards the traveling Chinese couple. So here you see the attitude here was negative, but the behavior was positive. Thus, attitude may not always predict actual pattern of one's behavior. Right? This is a very important example that we all can give, because this is empirical based study, and that this is very apt example also. If you have any other example of this sort, you can always give this. Now let's talk about this very important question: differentiate between prejudice and stereotype. Now this in my previous video also I have tried to explain, because this is one topic where students get confused. They are not able to understand what is prejudice and what is stereotype, and what actually are the difference between these two. So now let's see what this book says. That what is prejudice? Prejudice are examples of attitude. Basically, prejudice is an attitude only, right? Towards a particular group, they are usually negative, and in many cases may be based on the stereotypes, right? So it's many cases it's based on the stereotypes. So first let's understand what are the stereotypes again. It is a cluster of ideas, as we had been talking about, regarding the characteristics of a specific group, right? So when we are actually explaining this kind of question, differentiate between prejudice and stereotype, you will first define what prejudice is, and then you will define what stereotype is. right? So what is stereotype? It is a cluster of ideas regarding the characteristics of a specific group. If this is a target group, so there is a cognitive component, right? Cognitive component or the cluster of ideas, right? Against, regarding, not against, regarding this target group. That is what is stereotype, right? So stereotype consists of undesirable characteristics about the target group. Undesirable, that is, they have defined a certain social norms and then consist of undesirable characteristics about the target group, and they lead to the negative attitudes. So now this negative attitude, when the negative attitude is developed, that is the prejudice or prejudices towards member of a specific group, that is the target group. Okay, thus prejudice may be based on the stereotypes, right? Not always stereotypes are based on prejudice, but prejudice may be based on stereotype. One more thing that we can always describe here is the discrimination part, right? So discrimination is also arised through stereotype, right? If you see here, prejudice also may get translated into discrimination, where you are having a negative attitude towards a target group, negative attitude towards a target group, that is the discrimination. So prejudice is a attitude. It can be based on the stereotype, that is the cognitive component. Now how stereotype is developed? It is a cluster of ideas regarding the characteristics of a specific group. The cluster of idea is the cognitive component that we actually get influenced by the societal and environmental norms around us. Okay, so prejudice may also be translated into discrimination, the behavioral component. Now what is the behavioral component here is the discrimination part, where because of the prejudice or the stereotype, you start discriminating against the target group. When people behave in a less positive way, so it can be either a negative way or a less positive way. It can be either negative or a less positive way towards a particular group compared to other group which they favor. So one is the target group, right, through against which they are actually doing the stereotype, discrimination and prejudice, and other is the favored group, right? So for the favored group, the attitude is positive. For the target group, the attitude is negative or less positive. Okay, so now another question here is, I will scroll through that. This is 2024 question. Prejudice can exist without discrimination and vice versa. Discrimination can exist without prejudice. Or the other part can be, describe the relationship between prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice can exist without discrimination also, without being expressed as a discrimination. Similarly, discrimination can show without prejudice. Wherever prejudice and discrimination exist, conflicts are very likely to arise between the groups. So conflicts, this is one attribute that we all must mention here also when you are actually describing prejudice. So conflicts are very likely to arise between groups within the same society. Our own society has witnessed very deplorable instances of discrimination with and without prejudice based on gender, religion, community. So these all are what? The medical illness and physical handicap, mental handicap. Here we must also mental illness, right? And there are a number of things associated with that. So mental illness, physical handicap. So these all are what? Discrimination, right? Instances of discrimination need not be that these are facing the prejudice attitude. Moreover, in many cases, discriminatory behavior can be curbed by law. But the cognitive and emotional component, right, in the CAB model or ABC model, right? So these two, because these are not visible, right? Cognitive and emotional, that is affective, these are not visible, are more difficult to change. These are the components of prejudice. So when you are having a C or A, that is the cognitive, that is the learning, and the emotional aspect, because this is not visible, right? That cannot be curbed. But what can be curbed is what is the behavioral aspect. So discrimination is the behavioral aspect. Okay, so we will end